Picture a king, not one seated on a golden throne, basking in glory, but a king abandoned by all, hunted like a wild beast into the heart of an endless marsh. It is the winter of the year 878, and England, as it was known, is dead. Its body has been torn apart by the wolves of the north, its soul seemingly vanished with the smoke of burning monasteries. In the damp, reed-choked swamps of Somerset, in a place called Athelney, the last ember of hope is hiding. Alfred, King of Wessex. He is not the leader of a mighty army, but a fugitive whose kingdom has shrunk to the size of a muddy island. The air here smells of silt and despair. A cold fog clings to his clothes like a burial shroud, and the only music is the whisper of the wind and the distant howl of wolves, so easily mistaken for the victory cries of the Vikings. This is a scene of absolute humiliation, the lowest point for a monarch, God's anointed. In this moment, there is nothing great about him. He is the living embodiment of a paradox. A ruler whose authority has vanished, a warrior who has lost his army, a scholar whose books and wisdom have proven powerless against the fury of steel. Here, among the marshes, the central question of his story is not a philosophical dilemma, but a cry of desperation. How can this man, broken, sick, and forsaken by fortune, rise from the mud to challenge the invincible force that has burned his world to the ground? It is here, at this point of no return, when history seemed to have already passed its verdict, that the true story of Alfred the Great begins. Because only one who has known absolute darkness can find a light bright enough to illuminate the path for an entire nation. This king in the reeds is not the end of the story, but its true, harsh beginning. The prologue to the greatest triumph of will over circumstance. To understand the scale of the catastrophe that engulfed Alfred, you must see the world as a person of the 9th century saw it. The England of that time was not a unified country, but a fragile, ever-warring confederation of 7 Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, known as the Heptarchy. Northumbria, Mercia, East Anglia, Essex, Kent, Sussex, and Wessex, these were not parts of a whole, but separate worlds, jealously guarding their independence, bound only by a shared Christian faith and constant border wars. It was a chessboard where kings moved in an endless, exhausting game for local dominance, failing to notice the storm gathering on the horizon. And the storm came. From the late 8th century, a new and terrifying force surged from across the gray sea, from the misty fjords of Scandinavia, in their swift, dragon-headed longships, the Vikings. To the Christian chroniclers, they were not mere invaders, but a scourge from God, a punishment for mankind's sins. They didn't seek land or negotiations. They were the embodiment of pure, primal predation. Their tactic was like a lightning strike, a sudden raid on a defenseless monastery or trading town, followed by plunder, murder, and slavery. And then they were gone, back to the sea, as elusive as ghosts. But in the middle of the 9th century, in the year 865, the situation changed dramatically. It was no longer a band of raiders that landed on the shores of East Anglia, but something the chronicles called, with a shudder, the Heathen here, the great heathen army. This was an organized force, led by the legendary sons of Ragnar Lodbrok, Ivar the Boneless, and Halfdan. Their goal was no longer plunder, but conquest. Kingdom after kingdom fell before them like dominoes. The great center of learning, Northumbria, was crushed. East Anglia became their domain, its king, Edmund, martyred and killed. The mighty kingdom of Mercia, which once dominated all of England, was brought to its knees. By the time Alfred ascended to the throne of Wessex, his kingdom was the last island of Anglo-Saxon sovereignty in a sea of pagan fire. He was not just a king, he was the keeper of a dying flame, with the full horror of the age bearing down on him alone. Alfred came from an ancient and noble line that traced its genealogy to Cerdic himself, the legendary founder of the Kingdom of Wessex in the 6th century. He was the son of King Ethelwulf, a devout and warlike ruler who was among the first to grasp the scale of the Viking threat, even winning a significant victory over them at the Battle of Edington in 851. Alfred, however, was the youngest, the fourth of 5 sons. In the brutal world of the early Middle Ages, where the right to rule was determined by the sword and by age, his chances of reaching the throne were almost zero. His path seemed preordained. A quiet, scholarly life in a monastery, devoted to books and God, while his older, stronger, more warlike brothers, Ethelbald, Ethelbert, and Ethelred, would in turn bear the burden of the crown and the weight of the war. Fate itself seemed to be grooming him as a scholar, not a monarch. He was an inquisitive, thoughtful child who, according to his biographer Asser, showed an incredible thirst for knowledge from an early age, memorizing Anglo-Saxon songs and dreaming of learning to read, a great rarity even for the nobility of the time. While his brothers practiced with sword and spear, Alfred immersed himself in the world of Psalms and Chronicles. The contrast between him and his brothers was stark and defining. They were products of their age, an age of warriors. He seemed an anachronism, a man born out of his time. But history, that great and ironic dramatist, had other plans. One by one, his brothers were consumed in the fire of the war with the Vikings. Ethelbald and Ethelbert ruled only briefly. Then came the turn of Ethelred, alongside whom the young Alfred received his baptism of fire. When Ethelred also fell in battle in 871, all eyes turned to the last surviving son of Ethelwulf. At the age of 22, Alfred the Bookworm, the intellectual, was forced to accept the crown of Wessex. It was not a prize, but a death sentence. He inherited not a flourishing state, but a kingdom in agony, bleeding to death under the blows of the Danes. The burden that had proven too great for his 3 warrior brothers now fell upon the frail shoulders of the youngest, the one seemingly least prepared for the role. His ancestry had become a curse, and he would have to either die with honor or achieve the impossible. In the lives of great men, there are often moments that, in hindsight, seem like omens, quiet prophecies woven into the fabric of their early years. For Alfred, such a moment was his astonishing journey to Rome, the heart of the Christian world, when he was only 4 or 5 years old. In the year 853, his father, King Ethelwulf, sent his youngest and perhaps favorite son to the Eternal City with a grand escort. This was not merely a pilgrimage. It was a significant diplomatic and symbolic act. In Rome, the young Anglo-Saxon prince was received by Pope Leo IV himself. According to the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, the Pope consecrated him as king, though this was likely a later interpretation meant to strengthen Alfred's legitimacy. It is more probable that the Pope granted him the honorary title of a Roman consul, which was still a tremendous honor. But for an impressionable boy raised in deep faith, this meeting had colossal significance. Imagine the scene. A small child from a distant, war-torn land, standing before the vicar of St. Peter, at the center of a 1,000-year-old civilization, surrounded by majesty and holiness. This experience was forever etched into his mind. He didn't just see Rome. He felt himself part of something larger than his small island world, He touched the legacy of an empire, the universal idea of a Christian order that stood against the pagan chaos embodied by the Vikings. This journey became for him an invisible cross and an unseen crown. It instilled in him a profound conviction that he and his kingdom were under the special protection of God. This belief in his destiny would become his main pillar of support in the darkest hours. When all seemed lost, when his kingdom lay in ruins and he was hiding in the marshes, it was the memory of the papal blessing, of his symbolic link to the center of the Christian world, that would fuel his unbreakable will. He would fight not just for land and power, but for the entire Christian order, for which he had been anointed a defender in his very childhood. This omen did not grant him physical strength or an invincible army, but it gave him something far more important: the certainty that his cause was just, and that history and God were on his side. The central, defining factor of Alfred's entire life, the key to understanding his character and, paradoxically, his genius, was his constant, agonizing battle with his own body. From a young age until his death, he was plagued by a mysterious chronic illness, which modern researchers, based on the descriptions of his biographer Asser, most often identify as Crohn's disease, a severe inflammatory bowel condition. Asser describes sudden, debilitating attacks of acute pain that could strike the king at any moment, at a feast, in council, even during a battle. This illness was his secret, relentless enemy, a shadow that followed him everywhere. In an era when a leader, especially a military one, had to be a model of physical strength and endurance, Alfred was a man constantly living on the edge of physical collapse. This pain was his forge. While other young men of his circle tempered their bodies through hunting and martial exercises, Alfred was forced to spend long hours in solitude, and he turned this forced inaction into his greatest advantage. He immersed himself in the one world where his physical frailty didn't matter, the world of books, knowledge, and contemplation. His thirst for knowledge was insatiable. He didn't just learn to read. He became one of the most educated men of his time, gathering scholars from all over England and Europe to his court. Pain sharpened his mind like a whetstone sharpens a blade. It taught him patience, discipline, and an incredible strength of will. Every day was a battle for him, and by winning this internal battle, he prepared for the external ones. Moreover, his suffering deepened his piety, transforming it from a formal faith into a deeply personal, passionate relationship with God. He saw his illness as a divine trial, a way to humble his pride and guide him onto the true path. This constant proximity to death stripped him of the fear of it on the battlefield and endowed him with a fatalism that allowed him to take risks where others would have retreated. It was this dialectic of weakness and strength that shaped a unique leader. His body was a fragile vessel, but within it burned an unquenchable fire of intellect, tempered in the crucible of ceaseless pain. He could not rely on the strength of his muscles, so he was forced to rely on the strength of his mind. And this is precisely what made him the only man capable of finding a novel, systemic solution to the Viking problem, a solution that would never have occurred to an ordinary warrior. Before he could be a king and a strategist, Alfred had to prove he was a warrior. That moment came in the year 871, a year that went down in the history of Wessex as the year of 6 battles. The great heathen army, having already conquered Northumbria and East Anglia, fell upon the last Anglo-Saxon kingdom with all its might. At the time, Alfred's elder brother, Ethelred, was king, while the 22-year-old Alfred held the title of Secundarius, the second in command. his recognized heir. The climax of this bloody year was the Battle of Ashdown. The army of Wessex faced the main Viking force on the Berkshire Downs. The Danes, having taken a strategic position on high ground, split their forces. One part was commanded by their kings, Bagsec and Halfdan, the other by their jarls. The Anglo-Saxons also divided their army. King Ethelred would face the kings, and the young Prince Alfred would face the jarls. But before the battle, a delay occurred that would become legendary. King Ethelred, a devout man, refused to enter the fray until the mass he was attending in his tent was over. He declared he would not forsake the service of God for the service of men. Meanwhile, the Vikings began their advance, their shield wall moving slowly and menacingly down the hill, threatening to crush the Anglo-Saxon force. Alfred, seeing the mortal danger in delay, faced a choice: obey the king's command and wait, risking certain defeat, or take the initiative and break the chain of command. In that moment, the scholarly prince, the bookworm, showed his true nature. Asser writes that Alfred, unable to endure the enemy's pressure any longer, made his decision. Like a wild boar, he led his troops in a desperate charge up the slope. It was a tactically suicidal move to attack a shield wall from a lower position, but there was no choice. It was the first roar of the lion that had, until then, hidden in his brother's shadow. Seeing Alfred's furious charge, King Ethelred's men, his prayers finally complete, joined the battle. A brutal, hours-long melee ensued, where, as Asser writes, Christians and pagans fought for life itself. In the end, thanks to Alfred's audacity and the resilience of the Wessex warriors, the Vikings were broken and fled. It was a great victory, though not a decisive one in the war. But its main significance was something else. On that day, England saw for the first time the Alfred who would save it. It saw that behind the outward frailty and love of books lay an iron will, a readiness to risk everything, and the instinct of a true leader capable of taking full responsibility at the most critical moment. Behind every great deed lies not only calculation, but also a deep, often hidden, personal motivation. To understand Alfred's unbreakable will, it is not enough to speak of his patriotism or his sense of duty. We must look into his soul, where a private, unseen war was raging. The main driving force for Alfred, both his inner demon and his guardian angel, was his unique, almost ecstatic piety, magnified by his physical suffering. For him, the war with the Vikings was not simply a geopolitical conflict. It was an eschatological, holy crusade. In his eyes, the Danes were not just enemies. They were servants of the devil, the horde of the Antichrist, sent to destroy the true faith. Every burned monastery, every desecrated altar, was a personal wound to him, an insult to his God. He saw himself not merely as a king, but as the last defender of Christendom on his island, a warrior of Christ, like the biblical King David facing Goliath. This conviction gave his actions incredible energy and justified any brutality in the eyes of his comrades and himself. But there was another, more intimate side to his faith. His chronic illness, which had tormented him since his youth, was a constant reminder of the fragility of human life and the omnipotence of God. He prayed desperately for healing, made pilgrimages, and gave alms, trying to strike a kind of bargain with heaven. It is entirely possible that he believed that if he could save Christian England from the pagans, God would, in return, grant him relief from his physical agony. Thus, his struggle for England became his personal struggle for salvation, both physical and spiritual. This explains his obsession, his inability to surrender even when all seemed lost. As he hid in the marshes of Athelney, he was sustained not only by the hope of a comeback, but by a deep faith that God would not abandon his chosen warrior until his mission was complete. This internal, almost fanatical conviction was the nuclear reactor that fueled his will. It turned fear into determination, despair into strategy, and pain into fuel for the fight. He was not fighting for a crown as such. He was fighting for divine order on earth and for peace in his own tormented soul. When Alfred took the throne in 871, he became the captain of a ship that was already sinking. The great heathen army, like a relentless tide, had swallowed all the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms except his own. Northumbria, the cradle of Anglo-Saxon culture, had been turned into a puppet state. East Anglia had become a Viking foothold. Mercia, once the greatest power of the Heptarchy, was partitioned and humiliated. Wessex remained the last bastion, the last Anglo-Saxon kingdom that could still call itself free. Alfred, the 22-year-old king who inherited the throne after his brother's death in the midst of war, understood that he was not just defending his borders, he was defending the very idea of England. If Wessex fell, the history of the Anglo-Saxons, their language, their faith, and their laws would most likely come to an end. He was not just a monarch. He had become the living symbol of resistance. The first years of his reign were a desperate struggle for survival. It was a series of grueling battles, tactical retreats, and temporary truces. He paid off the Vikings, giving them tribute, the Danegeld, to buy precious time, knowing it was merely a delay, not a solution. He was forced to watch as parts of his own kingdom were raided and ravaged. In this constant struggle, he was forged as a leader, learning from his mistakes, studying the enemy, their strengths and weaknesses. He saw that the Vikings were strong in swift attacks, but vulnerable in long campaigns and sieges. He realized their strength was mobility, and that mobility had to be neutralized. This period of desperate defense was critically important. It transformed Alfred from an idealistic youth into a pragmatic, battle-hardened strategist. He was the king of the last frontier, a position that left no room for error. Every decision he made, every order he gave, carried the weight of a nation's fate. The pressure was unimaginable, but it was this pressure that turned the coal of his talents into the diamond of his genius. He carried on his shoulders not just a crown, but the entire weight of a dying civilization. And this burden would either break him or turn him into a titan. In every great drama, the hero needs a worthy antagonist, a figure who is his mirror image and the embodiment of the forces he fights. For Alfred, that antagonist was Guthrum, one of the leaders of the great heathen army. If Alfred was the embodiment of Christian order, scholarship, and strategic thought, Guthrum was the living personification of pagan chaos, primal fury, and raw military power. He was no primitive barbarian. He was a cunning, experienced, and ruthless commander who had cut a path of fire and steel across England. He was one of those behind the crushing of East Anglia and Mercia, and now his gaze was fixed on the last prize, Wessex. Guthrum represented everything Alfred feared and despised. He was a warrior to the core, whose authority rested on personal charisma, luck in battle, and generosity to his men. His religion was one of strength, where the gods smiled on victors and glory was won in bloody combat. Unlike Alfred, who sought to build and create, Guthrum was a destroyer, a man of the storm who lived by plunder and war. Their confrontation was not just a clash of two armies. It was a conflict of two worldviews, two civilizations. Alfred, constantly suffering from his illness, forced to rely on the power of his mind, against Guthrum, brimming with health and strength, for whom the sword was an extension of his arm. The scholar versus the berserker, the strategist versus the tactician, the builder versus the destroyer. It was Guthrum's personality, his untamable energy and military talent, that made the Viking threat so deadly. He was not just another raider. He was a conqueror with the ambitions of a king. He knew not only how to fight, but also how to use treachery as a weapon, a lesson Alfred was about to learn firsthand. Their personal duel became the spine of the entire war for England. To defeat the Vikings, Alfred needed not just to break their army, he needed to understand and outplay the mind of their leader. He had to find a way to defeat not only Guthrum's strength, but also what he believed in, transforming him from a scourge of God into an instrument in his own hands. Early in his reign, Alfred still held out hope that the Vikings could be reasoned with, that their word, sealed by a sacred oath, meant something. This dangerous idealism led him to one of the most humiliating and instructive mistakes of his life. In the year 876, after another series of battles, Alfred managed to trap Guthrum's army in the fortress of Wareham. The Vikings' position was desperate, and they sued for peace. Alfred, eager to avoid further bloodshed, and perhaps still not fully confident in his own strength, agreed to negotiate. He demanded from the Danes not only tribute but also the most sacred oaths they could give. The Vikings swore on their holy rings, relics which, according to the chronicler, they had never before used to swear oaths to foreigners. To please Alfred, they also swore on Christian relics. The King of Wessex believed them. He accepted hostages, paid them money, and allowed them to leave Wareham. It was a moment when the logic of a civilized man, for whom an oath is an unbreakable contract, clashed with the logic of a predator, for whom any means are justified to achieve a goal. No sooner had the ink dried on this imaginary treaty than Guthrum demonstrated the true worth of his promises. During the night, the Vikings treacherously slaughtered the Anglo-Saxon hostages, and breaking out of Wareham, raced to Exeter and captured it. Alfred was stunned and humiliated. He realized his enemy did not play by the rules. For the Vikings, an oath was just a tactical maneuver, a way to buy time and regroup. This episode at Wareham became a harsh but priceless lesson for Alfred. He grasped a fundamental truth. You cannot speak the language of diplomacy and honor with a force that recognizes no moral law but the law of strength. You cannot negotiate with wolves. You can only kill them or cage them. This betrayal burned away the last remnants of his naivety. He understood that peace with this enemy was impossible. Only victory or total annihilation were options. The lesson of Wareham was bitter, but it laid the foundation for Alfred's future, much tougher and more pragmatic strategy. He would never again take the Vikings at their word and would rely only on the strength of arms and the impregnability of walls. The height of Alfred's humiliation and Guthrum's triumph came at the beginning of the year 878, in an event that nearly erased Wessex from the map. After his treacherous breakout from Wareham and maneuvers in Mercia, Guthrum prepared his most audacious and devastating strike. He decided to attack Wessex when it was least expected. On the eve of the 12th night feast, in the dead of winter, when armies typically were not fighting but feasting, Guthrum's army made a lightning-fast move and launched a surprise attack on the royal residence at Chippenham. The Anglo-Saxons were caught completely off guard. It was not a battle, but a massacre. The royal court was virtually annihilated, its defenses shattered. Alfred himself, with a small group of bodyguards, miraculously escaped death or capture. He was forced to flee, abandoning everything: his family, his treasury, his kingdom. Overnight, he went from being a king to an exile in his own land. The defeat at Chippenham was an absolute catastrophe. It broke the Anglo-Saxons' will to resist. Many nobles either fled across the sea to Francia or submitted to the Vikings, accepting their rule. Wessex, the last bastion of resistance, had fallen. Guthrum was the effective master of all England. For Alfred, this was a moment of truth, a point of existential despair. Everything he had fought for, everything he believed in, had collapsed in a single day. It was after this rout that he found refuge in the impassable marshes of Athelney. This was his personal rock bottom, his Gethsemane. It is easy to imagine his state of mind: humiliation, anger, fear, doubts in a God who seemed to have abandoned him. Any other man in his place would have broken, surrendered, or died. But it was here, at this point of total collapse, that the true measure of Alfred's character was revealed. He didn't just survive, he began to think. Deprived of his army, treasury, and power, he was left with the one weapon that could not be taken from him: his mind. And it was from the depths of this humiliation that he would begin his long, almost impossible journey to rebirth. The Christmas massacre at Chippenham was not the end of his story, but the crucible in which all his weaknesses and illusions were burned away, leaving behind only the pure, tempered steel of an unbending will. Alfred's refuge, the marshes of Athelney in Somerset, was a place perfectly suited for a fugitive. It was a labyrinth of fens, rivers, and reed-covered islands, virtually impassable for a stranger, let alone a large army. For the Vikings, whose strength lay in rapid movement across open country, this terrain was a nightmare. But for Alfred, these swamps became more than just a hiding place. They became his university, his laboratory for developing a strategy of revenge. Stripped of the external trappings of power, he was forced to turn to his inner resource, his intellect. Here, in the silence and isolation, broken only by the cries of birds, he could finally stop and analyze the reasons for his defeats. He understood that trying to beat the Vikings in open battle, playing by their rules, was a path to disaster. Their army was more mobile, more experienced, and more ferocious. He had to change the very nature of the war. He began to think asymmetrically. If the Vikings are fast, you must deny them mobility. If they live by plunder, you must deny them the opportunity to plunder. If they strike at defenseless targets, you must ensure there are no defenseless targets left. It was here, in the mud of Athelney, that the outlines of his future great reforms were born. He started small. Gathering the remnants of his loyal followers, he turned his island fort into a base for guerrilla warfare. His bands launched sudden, precise raids on small Viking parties and foragers, sowing fear and uncertainty in their ranks. He turned the land of Wessex from an object of plunder into a hostile, deadly territory. For the Danes, every trip for supplies could now end in ambush and death. Alfred, the victim, began to think like a hunter. He used his knowledge of the terrain, the support of the local population, and the element of surprise, all the things that were the Vikings' own strengths. This was a war of attrition, a war of nerves. He couldn't defeat the great army in a single blow, but he could slowly and methodically bleed it, undermine its morale, and deprive it of resources. The strategy born in the swamp was the strategy of the weak against the strong, of mind over muscle. And while Guthrum feasted and captured Chippenham, believing the war was over, his unseen, seemingly crushed enemy in the marshes of Somerset was transforming into the most dangerous opponent he had ever faced. From the grim chronicles of guerrilla war in the Athelney marshes, one of the most famous and humanizing legends of Alfred was born, the story of the burnt cakes. According to the tale, while hiding from the Vikings, the king took shelter in the hut of a peasant woman who did not know who he was. The woman, leaving to do her chores, asked the stranger to watch some cakes that were baking on the hearth. Alfred, however, was so lost in thought, sketching battle plans on the ground, pondering the fate of his kingdom, praying for salvation, that he completely forgot his task. When the woman returned, she found the cakes burnt to a crisp. Not knowing she was addressing her king, she berated him for his laziness and carelessness. "You're happy to eat them when they're ready, but you can't be bothered to watch them cook." Alfred, the legend says, humbly accepted her anger without revealing his identity. This simple story, regardless of its historical accuracy, has deep symbolic meaning. First, it humanizes Alfred, turning him from an epic hero into a real person, capable of mistakes and absent-mindedness. It shows him at his most vulnerable, when the savior of a nation is unable to handle the simplest domestic task. Second, the legend is a perfect illustration of his complete immersion in strategy. His mind was so consumed with the global task of saving England that the material world, with its cakes, simply ceased to exist for him. It is a symbol of the intellectual fire that burned within him as he forged his plan. While his body was in a peasant's hut, his mind was on the battlefields of the future. Meanwhile, his guerrilla bands continued their work. These small but constant pinpricks were critically important. They prevented the Vikings from feeling like the true masters of the land. They kept the flame of resistance alive in the hearts of the Anglo-Saxons, reminding them that their king was alive and still fighting. Every successful ambush, every recaptured supply wagon, was a small victory that chipped away at the myth of Danish invincibility. Alfred acted like a doctor treating a severe illness, not with one radical surgery, but with a series of precise, measured injections, slowly weakening the virus that had infected the body of his kingdom. The legend of the cakes and the reality of the guerrilla war are two sides of the same coin, showing a king who, even at rock bottom, continued his great intellectual and military work. After months of grueling guerrilla warfare from the swamps, Alfred knew the time had come for decisive action. While in hiding, he had not only been harassing the enemy, but also sending messengers throughout Wessex to the ealdormen and thanes who remained loyal. He gave them a secret time and place to gather. That place was Egbert's Stone, an ancient megalith on the border of the modern counties of Somerset, Wiltshire, and Dorset, a site with sacred significance for the people of Wessex. The choice was a stroke of genius. This was not just a military muster, but a symbolic act of national rebirth at the hallowed stone of their ancestors. On the appointed day, in the 7th week after Easter, Alfred and his small band emerged from the marshes. It was a moment of incredible risk. He didn't know if anyone would answer his call, if he would be betrayed, or if an ambush awaited him. But when he arrived at Egbert's Stone, a triumphant sight met his eyes. From all directions, contingents of the fired, the militia, from Somerset, Wiltshire, and part of Hampshire, were streaming towards him. The chronicler describes the scene with undisguised joy. And when they saw the king, they received him as one risen from the dead after so many tribulations, and they were filled with a great joy. This moment was the turning point of the war. It was proof that the months of guerrilla fighting had not been in vain. The people had not forgotten their king. They had only been waiting for a signal to rally to his banner once more. The return of hope was palpable. Men who months before had submitted to the Vikings in fear or hidden in the woods were now an army again, united by a common purpose and faith in their leader. For Alfred, this was the greatest psychological victory. He had emerged from the swamps not as a mere fugitive, but as the recognized leader, a symbol of the indomitable spirit of the Anglo-Saxons. He now had an army again. It may not have been as well armed or experienced as Guthrum's host, but it was inspired by righteous anger and love for its returned king. From Egbert's stone, this reborn army marched towards its destiny, towards the decisive battle that would determine who would own England. Alfred's greatest strategic insight, his most enduring and brilliant contribution to the art of war, was the concept of the Burgle system. Analyzing Viking tactics in his swamp solitude, he realized their main advantage, speed and mobility, could be turned into their greatest weakness. The Vikings were like water. They seeped through any defense, flowing around large armies to strike at unprotected targets. Alfred decided the only way to stop water was to build dams. These dams became a network of 33 fortified towns, or burhs, strategically placed throughout Wessex. This was not just a series of isolated forts, but a meticulously planned, interconnected system of defense in depth. The burhs were located so that no inhabitant of the kingdom was more than 20 miles, a day's march, from the nearest refuge. Each burh was not only a military garrison, but also an administrative and commercial center, with a permanent population responsible for maintaining the fortifications. The plan was monumental, requiring incredible resources and organizational effort. Alfred used old Roman forts, fortified existing towns, and built new strongholds from scratch. Their design was carefully considered: earthen ramparts topped with wooden palisades, surrounded by ditches, with a planned grid of streets inside to allow troops to move quickly to any point of attack. This system completely changed the rules of the game. Now the Vikings had no easy targets left. Wherever they went, they ran into a burh. They couldn't ignore it, as the garrison could strike their rear and cut off their supply lines. But they also lacked the skill and patience for sieges. It took too much time and resources, robbing them of their key advantage, mobility. The entire territory of Wessex was transformed into a giant chessboard, where each burh was a powerful piece controlling the surrounding area. This was the architecture of victory, created by the mind of a scholar. Alfred did not try to create an army equal in strength to the Vikings. Instead, he changed the very environment in which the war was fought, making it deadly for the enemy. The Burgle system became the steel skeleton upon which he could rebuild his kingdom. It was a triumph of engineering and strategic thought over brute force, and it was this system, not a single victorious battle, that ultimately broke the back of the Danish invasion. Building impregnable walls was only half the solution. Those walls needed defenders, and defenders capable not only of holding out, but of striking back at the enemy in the field. Alfred understood that the traditional Anglo-Saxon militia system, the fyrd, was ineffective against the constant Viking threat. The fyrd was a levy of all free landowners, or thanes, who were obligated to serve for a set number of days each year. The problem was that these warriors were difficult to assemble quickly, were reluctant to leave their lands for long, especially during planting or harvest, and simply went home when their service was up, leaving the kingdom defenseless. This allowed the Vikings to simply wait until the fyrd disbanded and then strike a weakened country. Alfred, with his systematic approach, saw this flaw and carried out a military reform that was revolutionary for its time. He did not abolish the fyrd, but reorganized it by dividing it in two. From then on, one half of the militia was on active military duty, manning the burhs or serving in the field army, while the other half tended to their farms. After a set period, they would switch places. This principle of rotation was brilliant in its simplicity. It provided Wessex with a permanent standing army without crippling the kingdom's economy. Now Alfred always had a force at hand, capable of both defending the burhs and pursuing Viking raiding parties. This was the birth of a proto-professional army. Furthermore, he changed the social composition of the force. He required every landowner, depending on the size of his holdings, to provide one fully equipped warrior. This improved the quality of the army's arms and training. He created an elite corps of royal Thegns, well-trained and personally loyal to him. This reform was no less important than the building of the burhs. If the burhs were the skeleton of the new Wessex, the reformed fyrd was its muscle. Alfred once again applied his intellectual rather than forceful approach. He didn't try to find more warriors. He made the ones he had work more effectively. He solved the problem not with numbers, but with organization. This reform showed he was not just a general, but a brilliant state administrator, capable of thinking decades ahead, creating a system that would outlive him and ensure England's security for generations to come. Alfred was a man who learned from mistakes, both his own and those of others. He saw that the Vikings came from the sea, and their strength was in their ships, their longships, which gave them unparalleled mobility. They could strike anywhere on the coast and disappear just as quickly. The strategist king understood that a land-based defense, even one as sophisticated as the burgle system, was only part of the solution. To truly defeat the enemy, he had to be met in his own element, at sea. Thus was born the idea that earned Alfred the title Father of the English Navy. He ordered the construction of ships, but he didn't just copy the Danish longships. He once again applied his analytical mind to create something better. According to the chronicles, new ships were built to his own design, superior to the longships in every way. They were almost twice as long, with 60 oars or more, making them faster and more powerful. They had a deeper draft and higher sides, which gave them an advantage in combat. Anglo-Saxon warriors could fire down on the Vikings and were better protected from enemy arrows and spears. This was not just a quantitative, but a qualitative superiority. Alfred did not try to create a fleet for raiding, like the Vikings. His fleet was designed for defense, to patrol the coast and intercept enemy flotillas before they even reached the shore. This was another component of his integrated security system. The burhs protected the land, the reformed fyrd provided a field army, and the navy locked the sea gates to his kingdom. The first naval battles of the new fleet, which took place in the 880s and 890s, proved the effectiveness of this approach. The Anglo-Saxon ships successfully intercepted and destroyed Viking squadrons, demonstrating that Wessex was no longer a helpless victim. The creation of the navy was the pinnacle of Alfred's strategic genius. He understood that to defend an island, you need sea power. This simple but profound idea laid the foundations for England's future greatness as a maritime nation. A sick, land-bound king, who perhaps never went to sea himself, had, by the force of his intellect, unlocked the key to naval dominance and created a weapon that would protect his country for centuries after his death. It was another brilliant example of how his mind compensated for any physical limitation. After assembling his army at Egbert's Stone, Alfred did not delay. He knew his strength lay in unity and surprise, and that he could not hold the militia together for long. He led his forces straight towards Guthrum's main army, which intelligence placed near Edington. In May of 878, the two armies met for the decisive battle that would determine the fate of England. Alfred, despite his illness, was at the forefront, inspiring his men. He addressed them with a speech, reminding them that they were fighting not just for their lives and their lands, but for their faith, for their wives and children, for the very existence of their people. The battle began with a ferocious Viking charge. They threw their full weight against the Anglo-Saxon line, trying to break through in their signature style. But Alfred's army was ready. They met the enemy with a shield wall, a dense, solid formation of warriors standing shoulder to shoulder, their spears bristling, protected by a wall of large, round shields. A long, bloody, and exhausting melee began. As the chronicler writes, both sides fought fiercely and for a long time. It was a direct clash of two philosophies of war: the berserker fury and individual skill of the Vikings against the iron discipline and collective resilience of the Anglo-Saxons. Hour after hour, the shield wall held. The warriors of Wessex, inspired by the presence of their king, stood their ground. They remembered their burned homes and desecrated churches, and this memory gave them strength. Gradually, the furious Viking onslaught began to falter. They were not accustomed to such stubborn, organized resistance. At the crucial moment, Alfred gave the order to counterattack. Exhausted but unbroken, the Anglo-Saxons moved forward as one, pushing the enemy back. Unable to withstand the pressure, the Viking line wavered and then broke. A panicked rout began. The Anglo-Saxons pursued them all the way to the fortress where Guthrum had taken refuge, killing all they could overtake. The victory at Edington was total and unconditional. It was not just a tactical success, it was a triumph of the spirit. An army of fugitives and desperate farmers, led by a sick scholar king, had crushed the invincible great heathen army. The Battle of Edington became the turning point of English history. It proved that the Vikings could be beaten and restored the Anglo-Saxons' faith in themselves. But Alfred's most brilliant move was yet to come. After the victory at Edington, Alfred laid siege to the fortress where Guthrum and the remnants of his army were trapped. After 2 weeks, starving and completely demoralized, the Vikings surrendered at the king's mercy. By the laws of the time, Alfred had every right to execute Guthrum and all his chieftains. It was expected of him. It would have been a clear and logical act of vengeance for all the suffering they had brought to his land. But Alfred did something completely unimaginable, something that went beyond the conventional logic of war. He offered Guthrum not death, but life; not shame, but honor. He demanded that Guthrum and 30 of his most noble warriors accept Christianity, and he offered to be the godfather to his own worst enemy. This was a move of pure genius, an act of the highest political wisdom disguised as religious mercy. Alfred understood that simply destroying Guthrum's army would not solve the problem. Another army would take its place, and the war would begin anew. He needed to neutralize the ideological foundation of the threat. By forcing Guthrum to be baptized, Alfred achieved several goals at once. First, he symbolically subordinated him to his God, transforming him from an enemy of Christ into his servant. Second, by becoming his godfather, he established a personal, almost familial bond with him, making future betrayal much more difficult and shameful. Guthrum was given a new Christian name, Ethelstan. Third, this act dramatically raised Alfred's own prestige in the eyes of the entire Christian world. He appeared not just as a successful general, but as a wise, merciful monarch capable of converting pagans to the true faith. The baptism ceremony was staged with maximum splendor. Guthrum spent 12 days as Alfred's guest and was showered with lavish gifts. It was a masterclass in psychological warfare. Alfred didn't just defeat Guthrum, he reprogrammed him, turning him from an implacable foe into a dependent vassal who owed him his life and his honor. This move was far more visionary and effective than any execution, no matter how bloody. It showed that Alfred's true strength lay not in his sword, but in his ability to think many moves ahead, using not only steel as a weapon, but also symbols, rituals, and faith itself. After the military and ideological triumph over Guthrum, it was time to secure it politically. Alfred was a realist and understood that it was impossible to drive all the Danes out of England at that moment. They controlled too much territory and were too numerous. So he took a pragmatic step that laid the foundations for England's future political landscape. Around the year 880, and then more formally in 886, the so-called Treaty of Alfred and Guthrum was established, officially dividing England into two zones of influence. The territories that remained under Danish control, Northumbria, East Anglia, and the eastern part of Mercia, became known as the Danelaw, or the area of Danish law. The border ran along the rivers Thames and Lea, and then up the river Ouse to the ancient Roman road, Watling Street. To the west and south of this line lay the lands controlled by Alfred, his native Wessex, western Mercia, and Kent. At first glance, this might seem like a concession, an admission of defeat. Alfred was ceding almost half the country to the enemy, but in reality, it was a brilliant strategic move. First, it halted the chaotic, uncontrolled advance of the Vikings. Now there was a clear, mutually recognized border. This transformed a war of annihilation into a state of managed coexistence. Second, the treaty legally established Alfred as the sole independent Anglo-Saxon king. All Anglo-Saxons living in the Danelaw theoretically remained his subjects, giving his descendants the moral right to eventually reunite the country. Third, it gave him precious peace and time to restore and strengthen his own kingdom. He no longer had to spread his forces across all of England, but could focus on building his burgher system, reforming the army, and reviving culture in the lands under his control. The creation of the Danelaw was an act of supreme political pragmatism. Alfred sacrificed a part to save the whole. He understood that sometimes, to win a war, you have to make an imperfect peace. This treaty was not the end of the struggle, but it moved it from a hot phase to a cold one, laying the foundation for the long and difficult process that would ultimately, after Alfred's death, lead to the creation of a single kingdom of England. One of Alfred's most important symbolic and strategic moves after establishing peace with Guthrum was the restoration of London. The ancient Roman city of Londinium, once a thriving commercial hub, had fallen into decay by the 9th century and suffered greatly from Viking raids. It was located right on the border with the Danelaw on the River Thames, and was more a pile of abandoned ruins than a living city. In the year 886, Alfred recaptured London from the Danes and began a massive project to rebuild it. This was more than just construction. It was a powerful political statement. He didn't just repair the old Roman walls, he built new fortifications, laid out a new street plan, and most importantly, repopulated the city with Anglo-Saxons. The chronicle states that all the English people that were not in bondage to the Danes submitted to him. The restoration of London served several purposes. First, it was a display of strength. Alfred was showing everyone, his own subjects and the Danes, that Anglo-Saxon power was back for good. He was rebuilding and fortifying a city that the Vikings had only managed to destroy. It was an act of creation versus an act of destruction. Second, London was of immense strategic importance. It controlled the mouth of the Thames, a vital waterway, and served as a powerful fortress on the border with the Danelaw. A fortified London became a lock, barring the Vikings' path into the heart of Wessex. Third, it was a step toward national unification. By taking Anglo-Saxons from various kingdoms under his protection as they flocked to the reviving city, Alfred was positioning himself not just as the King of Wessex, but as the protector of all English people. He appointed his loyal ally and son-in-law, Ethelred, the Ealdorman of Mercia, to govern the city, thereby strengthening the alliance between the two largest remaining Anglo-Saxon territories. The reborn London became a melting pot for a new, unified English identity. It was a symbol of the future, a prosperous, protected, and populous city, facing the enemy and standing as a bastion of order and law. For Alfred, the Builder King, this was one of his greatest triumphs, a tangible embodiment of his dream of a strong and united England. Alfred the Great was one of the first rulers in history to fully grasp that wars are won not only on the battlefield, but also in the pages of books. He understood that a people without a shared history is a people without a shared future. It was this deep conviction that led him to one of the most significant cultural projects of the Middle Ages, the creation, or at least the initiation and sponsorship, of the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle. This was not a simple record of events. It was an ambitious project to create a single national narrative, a history of the Anglo-Saxon people from their arrival in Britain to the present day. The Chronicle was written in Old English, the language of the people, not in Latin, the language of the church and scholarship. This was a deliberate choice. Alfred wanted his people's history to be accessible to the secular nobility and perhaps even to ordinary literate people. He sought to create a common information space that would unite Anglo-Saxons on both sides of the Danelaw border. In commissioning this chronicle, Alfred acted as history's editor-in-chief. Events were presented from the perspective of the Wessex dynasty, portraying it as the lawful and sole defender of England against the pagans. His own reign, his victories, and his reforms were described as the culmination of this long struggle. The Chronicle thus became a powerful tool of propaganda and a means of legitimizing his rule. It wove his deeds into the grand tapestry of national history, proving that his fight was not just a dynastic conflict, but a sacred mission to save the entire Anglo-Saxon people. Furthermore, the Chronicle served practical purposes. It recorded royal genealogies, important laws, and events, becoming a kind of historical and legal memory for the nation. By distributing copies of the Chronicle to monasteries throughout his kingdom, Alfred created a network of information centers that broadcast a unified version of the past and present. This was a weapon of words, no less powerful than his reformed army or his system of burrs. With the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, Alfred built not only fortresses of stone and timber, but also a fortress of national identity in the minds of his subjects. He understood that to defeat an enemy, you must first understand who you are, and he gave his people a story that answered that question. Alfred's military victories and political reforms were only the outer shell of his grand design. Deep down, he was convinced that the ultimate cause of all the calamities that had befallen his people was not military weakness, but spiritual and intellectual decay. The Viking raids had virtually destroyed the centers of learning, the monasteries where books were kept and copied. Literacy, even among the clergy, had fallen to a catastrophic level. Alfred wrote with sorrow in the preface to one of his translations. So completely had learning decayed among the English people that there were very few on this side of the Humber who could understand their divine services in English, or even translate a single letter from Latin into English. And I suppose that there were not many beyond the Humber either. He saw this ignorance as a mortal threat to the future of his kingdom. A people who could not read the word of God and the works of the wise was doomed to barbarism and defeat. Therefore, as soon as he had peace and resources, he launched an educational reform of unprecedented scale. He gathered the best scholars from across England and abroad at his court, creating a kind of think tank. But his main revolutionary idea was the translation of the most important books, those most necessary for all men to know, from Latin into the native Anglo-Saxon tongue. He personally took part in this work, acting not only as an organizer and patron, but also as a translator. Under his direction, fundamental works were translated, such as Pope Gregory the Great's Pastoral Care, a guide for priests, Orosius's Histories Against the Pagans, a world history, Bede's Ecclesiastical History of the English People, the history of England itself, and most remarkably, Boethius's Consolation of Philosophy, a profound philosophical treatise. This was a true cultural revolution. Alfred sought to create a body of literature in the vernacular to revive learning, first among the clergy and then among the secular nobility. He founded a court school where his own children and the children of his thanes were educated. His fight against ignorance was as much a crusade as his war against the Vikings. He understood that a strong state is built not only on swords and walls, but also on wisdom, law, and a common culture. He was healing not just the body of his kingdom, but its soul, laying the intellectual foundation for all of future English civilization. Alongside his military, administrative, and educational reforms, Alfred took another fundamental step to strengthen his kingdom: the creation of a unified code of laws, known as Alfred's Dambok, or Book of Laws. He did not try to create entirely new legislation from scratch. As a wise and conservative ruler, he understood the importance of tradition. His goal was to collect, organize, and harmonize the best laws of his predecessors, the kings of Kent, Mercia, and Wessex, to create a system acceptable to all Anglo-Saxons, not just his own people of Wessex. This was another step towards national unity. His code, however, was not a mere compilation. It was prefaced by a long introduction, which is a remarkable document in itself. In it, Alfred translated the Ten Commandments and other parts of biblical law from the Book of Exodus into Anglo-Saxon, thereby proclaiming that God's law must be the foundation of all human law. This was a powerful ideological statement. His kingdom was a Christian state, and its laws derived from divine authority. The code itself covered a wide range of issues, from murder and theft to oath-breaking and property damage. Special attention was paid to the protection of the church, as well as the weak and defenseless, widows, orphans, and foreigners. In Alfred's laws, we see a desire for justice, order, and stability. He tried to limit the practice of blood feuds by encouraging their replacement with a system of monetary fines, or vergild. He introduced severe penalties for betraying one's lord, emphasizing the importance of the feudal loyalty upon which all medieval society was built. Alfred's Book of Laws was not just a legal document. It was his manifesto as a Christian king, his attempt to build a city of God on earth. He sought to create a society based not on the rule of the strong, but on principles of justice enshrined in written law, a law that would be equal for all and would originate from the divine will. By creating a unified legal code, just as with the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle and his translations, he continued his titanic work of nation-building, stitching the patchwork of Anglo-Saxon tribes into a single fabric with a common law, a common history, and a common language. In the year 892, after more than a decade of relative peace, the system Alfred had built was put to its final and most severe test. A new, massive Viking army arrived in England from the continent, led by a renowned and experienced chieftain named Hásteinn. This was not the same army that had fought under Guthrum. These Vikings were hardened by years of fighting in the Frankish Empire and represented a formidable force. They landed in Kent in 2 large fleets and, joining with Danes from the Danelaw, began a new full-scale war against Wessex. But the England they encountered was no longer the defenseless country their predecessors had tormented 30 years earlier. Now they faced Alfred's system in all its might. Wherever they moved, they ran into impregnable burhs, whose garrisons fought them off and threatened their communications. Their attempts at siege failed. When they tried to raid deep into the country, they were pursued by the mobile field army created by the reform of the Fyrd. At sea, their ships were intercepted and sunk by the new Anglo-Saxon navy. The war lasted for 4 years and was incredibly fierce. The Vikings darted across the country, from Essex to Wales, trying to find a weak spot in Alfred's defenses, but they could not find one. The system worked perfectly. A striking example was the defense of the Boer at Chichester, which successfully repelled an attack by a huge Danish force. On another occasion, Alfred's son, Edward, and his son-in-law, Ethelred of Mercia, inflicted a crushing defeat on the Vikings at the Battle of Farnham. This last war was the final triumph of Alfred's strategy. He proved that his reforms were not a temporary fix, but a reliable and effective defense system capable of withstanding any blow. Finally, in 896, exhausted, starving, and having achieved no significant success, Hástein's army broke up. Some of the Vikings returned to the continent, while others settled in the Danelaw. Alfred had won his last war. He faced his old age as a king whose country was safe, his genius acknowledged and proven in the harshest of all crucibles, the crucible of war. The sick scholar had finally and decisively broken the invincible Vikings, not by the force of the sword, but by the power of the mind. And so we come to the solution of the central paradox. How did an ailing scholar defeat the most fearsome warriors of his age? The answer, as is often the case in history, is filled with deep irony. Alfred won not in spite of his weaknesses, but because of them. His physical frailty, his chronic illness, which would have been a death sentence for an ordinary warrior, became his gift. It forced him from a young age to abandon the path of brute force and follow the path of the intellect. While his peers relied on the strength of their muscles, he learned to rely on the strength of his mind. Pain taught him patience, strategic thinking, and the ability to see what others could not. He couldn't afford the luxury of a single, decisive, furious attack, as the Vikings did. His body would not have endured the strain. He was therefore forced to think in systems, to develop long-term strategies where victory was achieved not with a single blow, but by slowly and methodically strangling the opponent. His love of books, which many warriors disdained as a useless pastime, gave him access to a treasure trove of knowledge. He read about Roman military strategy, the history of ancient kingdoms, and the biblical warrior kings. He learned from the mistakes of others and borrowed their ideas. The Burgle system was, in essence, a creative reimagining of the Roman system of fortified borders. His legal and educational reforms were inspired by the examples of great rulers of the past, like Charlemagne. He was an innovator because he was a scholar. Where a Viking saw only a field for plunder, Alfred saw a complex system that needed not just to be defended, but to be rebuilt and improved. He was an architect, not just a warrior. He understood that chaos must be met not with greater chaos, but with absolute order, speed with stability, plunder with a protected economy, the ideology of force with the ideology of law and faith. His weakness forced him to seek unconventional solutions, and it was precisely these solutions that proved to be the right ones. He didn't become stronger than the Vikings on their own terms. He dragged them onto his terms, onto a chessboard he had designed himself, where he knew the rules for every square. On the 26th of October, 899, at the age of only 50 or 51, Alfred the Great died. He did not die on the battlefield, nor from a Viking's sword, but in his bed, from the same illness that had tormented him his entire life. His greatest enemy, the one that lived inside him, had finally won. But it was a Pyrrhic victory, because by then, Alfred had already won all the battles that mattered. His passing was quiet, not heroic in the traditional sense. But in this quiet end, there was a deep symbolism. The warrior of the spirit, who had spent his life fighting external chaos and internal pain, had at last found peace. His death completed the composition of his life, emphasizing once again that his greatness lay not in physical strength, but in something else, something far more durable. He left his son, Edward the Elder, not just a kingdom, but a functioning machine, a well-honed system of defense, a revived culture, and most importantly, the idea of a united England. He departed knowing he had laid a foundation upon which his heirs could build the edifice of a unified nation. He was buried in his capital, Winchester, the city he so loved and rebuilt. And though his remains were later lost during the turbulent events of English history, his true monument was not a tomb, but England itself. His journey was complete. He had accepted the crown when Wessex was on the brink of total annihilation, and he left the world leaving behind the strongest, most organized, and most culturally advanced state in Britain. His death was not the end of an era, but its logical conclusion and the beginning of a new one. The illness that had been his curse ultimately only served to highlight the scale of his triumph. He proved that it is possible to be physically imperfect and yet become one of the most perfect monarchs in history. Looking back across the centuries, Alfred's legacy only confirms the scale of his character. He is the only English monarch in history to be honored with the title the Great, and for good reason. His influence is still felt today. He is called the father of the English Navy, and although royal ships existed before him, it was he who created the Navy as a permanent, strategic instrument for the island's defense, laying a tradition that would centuries later make Britain the ruler of the seas. He is called the father of English prose for his titanic work translating Latin texts into his native tongue. He saved the Old English language from obscurity and turned it into a fully fledged literary language, capable of expressing complex philosophical and historical ideas. Without him, we would have neither Beowulf nor the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle in the form they have reached us. He was the savior of a nation. Historians agree that without his persistence, his genius, and his unbreakable will, Anglo-Saxon England would most likely have ceased to exist. It would have been absorbed by the Danes, and the entire subsequent history of the island would have taken a completely different course. Perhaps there would have been no Norman conquest in the form it took, no English common law, no language of Shakespeare. But his most important legacy is the very idea of England. Before Alfred, there were Kentishmen, Mercians, and West Saxons. He was the first to begin to think and act as a king of all the English. Through his laws, his chronicle, his language, and his struggle, he created a common cultural and political space that became the foundation for the future English nation. His descendants, his son Edward and his grandson Ethelstan, completed the work he began, driving the Vikings from the Danelaw and creating the unified kingdom of England. But they built on the foundation he had so painfully and brilliantly laid. Alfred is the starting point, a figure without whom modern Britain is unimaginable. He didn't just win a war, he forged the soul of a nation in the fires of adversity. And so we return to our central question, to the paradox. How did the victim become the victor? The answer is now clear and multi-layered. Alfred redefined the very concept of strength. In an age when strength was measured in muscle, height, and skill with a sword, he proved that true strength lies in intelligence, systems, and will. He turned his every disadvantage into a weapon. His illness became the source of his intellectual power. His status as a bookworm gave him access to strategies his enemies could not even conceive of. His initial position as a victim, hunted into the swamps, gave him the unique perspective of the weak, allowing him to develop the perfect asymmetric strategy. He did not try to become a Viking, to surpass them in fury and cruelty. Instead, he remained himself to the end. A scholar, an administrator, a builder. He won by opposing chaos with order. He built fortresses while they destroyed towns. He wrote laws while they lived by the rule of the strong. He translated books while they burned libraries. He transformed his kingdom into an impregnable, well-organized machine, against which the primitive military tactics of the Vikings were powerless. They were like a wave that broke against a granite cliff built by his mind. The process of turning the victim into the victor was not an act of revenge, but an act of creation. He did not just destroy the enemy. He built a world in which such an enemy could no longer dominate. He won by changing the rules of the game. And in this lies his greatest lesson. Victory belongs not to the strongest, but to the smartest, to the one who can turn their greatest weaknesses into their most powerful strengths. Alfred is the eternal proof that the mind, tempered by suffering and faith, is the most formidable weapon in humanity's arsenal. Ultimately, the story of Alfred the Great transcends the 9th century and the fate of a single island. It is a universal epic of the human spirit, a hymn to resilience and intellect. It teaches us that the darkest of times often give birth to the brightest of heroes, and that greatness can be hidden in the most unassuming, most fragile of shells. Alfred's story is a timeless reminder that civilization is a delicate construct that must be constantly defended, not only with weapons, but with knowledge, laws, and a shared memory. He showed that a true leader is not one who leads his people to a glorious death in battle, but one who builds for them a safe and just home. His life is a lesson in the power of ideas. The idea of a fortified network of towns, the idea of a standing army, the idea of a common law, the idea of a national history. It was these ideas, born in the mind of one sick man, that proved stronger than thousands of axes and hundreds of longships. They created a structure that could withstand chaos and ultimately absorb it. The story of Alfred leaves us with a profound and eternal question. What is the nature of true strength? Is it the power to destroy or the power to create? The fury of the moment or the patience of decades? The might of the body or the indestructibility of the mind? By looking at the legacy of the king who came out of the marshes to build a nation, we receive a complete and inspiring answer. The greatest victories in human history are won not by those who sow the wind, but by those who patiently plant gardens and build fortresses, knowing that only what is created by reason and will can withstand any storm and endure through the ages.